With just $35,000 left from her grandmother's inheritance and facing mounting debt after losing her job in the economic downturn, Sarah Williams took a chance that most called foolish. She purchased an abandoned auto repair barn in rural Massachusetts that no one else would touch. What she discovered, hidden behind a false wall, would not only change her life forever, but uncover an automotive treasure that collectors had been searching for decades to find. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Williams stared at her bank statement, the glow of her laptop screen illuminating her tired face in the dimly lit apartment. 35,427. 86. All that remained of her grandmother Eleanor's inheritance after paying off her student loans. 6 months ago, she had been a promising automotive journalist for a prestigious car magazine in Boston with a steady income and growing reputation. Now at 34, she was unemployed, her position eliminated when the magazine downsized, and she was 3 months behind on rent for her overpriced apartment. The auto industry that she had dedicated her career to writing about was transforming rapidly, leaving traditional publications struggling to survive. Her specialized knowledge of vintage automobiles, a passion passed down from her grandmother, seemed increasingly irrelevant in a world obsessed with electric vehicles and self-driving technology. "What would you do, Gran?" Sarah whispered to the empty room, running her fingers over the vintage silver pocket watch that had been her grandmother's prized possession. Eleanor Williams had been a pioneering female mechanic in the 1960s, breaking barriers in a male-dominated field, leaving Sarah with not just money, but a legacy of determination and grit. Sarah had promised herself she would use the inheritance wisely, perhaps for a down payment on a small home someday, or to start her own automotive blog. But as rejection emails from job applications piled up and her savings dwindled, those dreams seemed increasingly distant. Her roommate Olivia had already moved out, unable to cover Sarah's portion of the rent any longer. The eviction notice taped to their door gave her 30 days to vacate. That morning, scrolling through local property listings out of desperate curiosity rather than genuine hope, Sarah noticed something unusual. An upcoming county auction listed a dilapidated auto repair barn sitting on 2 acres of land in Millfield, a small town about 90 minutes west of Boston. The starting bid was just $30,000, nearly all she had left, but the listing noted, "Property sold as is, with all contents included." The photos showed a weathered building with faded Mitchells, auto repair signage, boarded windows and overgrown surroundings. According to the description, the property had been abandoned for nearly 20 years after the owner died without heirs, and the county had finally seized it for unpaid taxes. Most potential buyers would be deterred by the rural location and the extensive repairs needed, but something about it called to Sarah. Perhaps it was the connection to automobiles, or maybe just desperation. But for the first time in months, she felt a flicker of excitement. As Sarah drove toward the auction the next morning, memories of her former life played through her mind. 3 years earlier, she had been celebrated for her series of articles on America's forgotten car museums, earning a prestigious industry award. Her tiny apartment had been filled with vintage automotive memorabilia and stacks of classic car books. Weekends were spent at car shows or interviewing collectors for features. Her editor had praised her unique voice and encyclopedic knowledge of automotive history. Her grandmother had been her biggest supporter, encouraging her passion from childhood. Eleanor had taught her to change her first tire at age 8, to diagnose engine problems by sound at 12, and had taken her to her first classic car auction at 16. "Cars are more than machines," Eleanor would say. "They're pieces of history, markers of human ingenuity." When Eleanor passed away 14 months ago, leaving Sarah her modest savings and beloved tools, the inheritance had seemed like security. But then the magazine announced its restructuring, eliminating her position along with a dozen others. Her former colleagues had moved on to digital content creation or corporate communications. Some had left the industry entirely. Sarah had tried freelancing, but the opportunities were sporadic and payment unreliable. She had applied for positions at dealerships, museums, even as a tour guide at the Automotive Hall of Fame in Michigan. Nothing had materialized. The industry she loved seemed to be leaving her behind, just as surely as the vintage vehicles she wrote about had been replaced by modern transportation. As she approached Millfield, the rural landscape opened before her. Rolling hills, farmland, and scattered homes replaced the suburban sprawl outside Boston. In another life, she might have appreciated the picturesque scenery. Today, she focused only on what lay ahead, possibly the most reckless decision of her life. The Millfield County Courthouse was a modest brick building with white columns surrounded by oak trees that provided welcome shade from the June heat. Inside the crowded auction room, Sarah sat nervously, clutching her bidding paddle as if it might escape. Most attendees were real estate developers or local farmers looking to expand their holdings. The Mitchell property was lot number 17. Earlier that morning, she had driven past the barn to see it for herself. The reality was even more discouraging than the photos. The blue paint was weathered to a pale gray, the gravel driveway completely overtaken by weeds. A sagging porch wrapped around one side, and portions of the metal roof had rusted through. It looked nothing like the thriving business it must have once been. Next up, Lot 17, the former Mitchell's Auto Repair on Old Mill Road, the auctioneer announced. 2 acres with commercial zoning, building approximately 3,000 square feet. County assessment values land at $75,000, but significant repairs needed to structure. Starting bid, $30,000. Sarah held her breath, waiting for the flurry of bids that would quickly outpace her budget. But the room remained silent. The auctioneer looked around expectantly. Come on, folks, this is commercial property with highway frontage. $30,000 is a steal. Still nothing. Fine, let's start lower. Do I hear $25,000? Sarah raised her paddle hesitantly. $25,000, she called, her voice steadier than she expected. The auctioneer pointed to her. I have $25,000. Do I hear $26,000? A man in a suit glanced at the property listing, then shook his head slightly. $25,000 going once, going twice. A sold to bidder number 43. Sarah sat in stunned silence as people turned to look at her. She had just spent nearly all of her inheritance on a dilapidated building in a town where she knew no one. As she approached the front to complete the paperwork, the clerk gave her a curious look. You know why no one bid on that place, right? The woman asked quietly as Sarah signed the documents. Because it needs work, Sarah replied. The clerk shook her head. Old Frank Mitchell was a recluse for the last decade of his life. Strange man. Some say he was paranoid, always talking about people trying to steal from him. The place has been sitting empty since he died in 2003. Local kids say it's haunted. She lowered her voice. And there were rumors about his business practices. Some folks claim he was involved in some shady dealings with car parts. Nothing was ever proven, but... She shrugged, leaving the implication hanging. Sarah felt a chill despite the warm day. What had she gotten herself into? The keys to Mitchell's auto repair felt unnaturally heavy in Sarah's hand as she stood before her new property that afternoon. Up close, the building looked even more decrepit. The large barn-style doors that would have once allowed cars to enter were secured with a rusted chain and padlock. Weeds grew knee-high around the perimeter, and wasps had built nests in the eaves. "This is mine," Sarah whispered, the words sounding absurd even as she said them. It took several attempts to get the side door open, the wood swollen from years of neglect. When it finally gave way with a protesting creak, the musty smell of abandonment rushed out to greet her. Sarah flicked a light switch out of habit, but nothing happened. The electricity had been disconnected years ago. Using her phone's flashlight, she ventured inside. Dust motes danced in the beam of light as she surveyed what remained of Mitchell's business. Old service counters lined one wall, their surfaces thick with grime. Faded posters of classic cars hung crookedly. Empty oil containers and scattered tools littered the concrete floor. In one corner, rodents had clearly made homes in stacks of moldering automotive magazines. The main repair area was cavernous, with 3 service bays and hydraulic lifts frozen in time. Cobwebs stretched between abandoned equipment, and a calendar on the wall still showed April 2003. The month Frank Mitchell had reportedly died. The air felt heavy, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Sarah sank onto a dusty stool, the reality of her situation crashing down on her. She had spent almost everything she had on this decaying time capsule. The building would need a new roof, electrical rewiring, plumbing repairs, and countless other costly fixes before it could be usable for anything.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Even if she wanted to resell it, who would buy it? She couldn't even afford to have it demolished. Tears welled in her eyes as she confronted the magnitude of her mistake. This wasn't a fresh start. It was financial suicide. She had been so desperate for a connection to her past, to the automotive world she loved, that she had made a catastrophically impulsive decision. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the grimy windows, Sarah knew she couldn't afford a hotel. She returned to her car to retrieve the sleeping bag she had brought just in case, along with some bottled water and granola bars. Her first night as a property owner would be spent camping in what felt increasingly like a mausoleum to broken dreams. Sarah woke to sunlight streaming through a crack in the boarded windows, momentarily disoriented before remembering where she was. Her back ached from the hard floor, but the morning light transformed the space, revealing details she had missed in the previous evening's gloom. Despite the years of neglect, the bones of the building were surprisingly sound. The massive timber beams overhead showed no signs of rot, and the concrete floor, though stained and dusty, was uncracked. The old-growth lumber used in the walls had weathered the decades better than modern materials might have. After a breakfast of granola bars and water, Sarah began a more thorough exploration. Behind the main repair area, she discovered a small office with a desk, filing cabinets, and shelves of repair manuals dating back to the 1950s. Many were rare publications that automotive historians would value. In another room, she found a basic bathroom with a shower. The plumbing sputtered but still worked, delivering rust-colored water that eventually ran clear. Most promising was a compact apartment above the office, clearly where Frank Mitchell had lived during his later years. It was sparsely furnished with a bed, small kitchenette, and sitting area, all coated in dust but otherwise intact. With some cleaning, it could be habitable, saving her the cost of housing while she figured out her next steps. As Sarah swept decades of dirt from the apartment floor, her phone rang. Her friend Megan checking in. "You did what?" Megan exclaimed when Sarah explained her purchase. "Have you lost your mind?" "Probably," Sarah admitted, looking around at her surroundings. "But the building is actually better than I thought. With some work, I could live here while I figure things out. Maybe even start a small business related to classic cars, restoration consulting or something." "Or you could sell it and cut your losses," Megan suggested pragmatically. "Maybe," Sarah conceded, "but something tells me this place has potential." Frank Mitchell ran this shop for over 40 years. There must have been something special about it. After hanging up, Sarah continued her cleaning efforts, opening windows to release years of stale air. By mid-afternoon, the apartment was livable enough, not comfortable by any means, but shelter. She had discovered that the shop had its own well, meaning she had water, even if it wasn't particularly clear. A trip to the nearest town had yielded basic cleaning supplies, groceries, and a camping lantern. As the sun began to set on her second day of ownership, Sarah sat on the newly swept floor of the main shop area, allowing herself to imagine possibilities. The large space could accommodate several vehicles. With her knowledge of vintage cars and journalism background, perhaps she could create a specialty service for documenting classic car histories and provenance. Something collectors valued, almost as much as the vehicles themselves. It was a small glimmer of hope, but it was more than she had felt in months. As she drifted off to sleep that night on her makeshift bed, Sarah felt something shift within her, a sense that perhaps this desperate gamble wasn't the end of her story, but a strange new beginning. Sarah spent the next 3 days establishing a routine, cleaning in the morning when the temperature was cooler, exploring the property in the afternoon, and planning renovations in the evening by lantern light. She had managed to clear most of the main shop floor, organizing salvageable tools and disposing of decades of accumulated junk. On the 4th day, while sorting through a storage area at the back of the building, she noticed something odd about one section of the wall. Unlike the rest of the shop's wood siding, this 20-foot section was cinder block and newer than the surrounding structure. More curiously, there were faint tire tracks in the dust leading toward it, though they disappeared several feet. From the wall itself, Sarah ran her hands along the cinder blocks, tapping occasionally and listening to the sound. The hollow echo confirmed her suspicion. There was space behind this wall. Her pulse quickened as she examined the floor more carefully, noticing a nearly invisible seam running parallel to the wall. This wasn't just a wall, it was a disguised door. It took hours of searching before Sarah found the mechanism, a concealed lever inside what appeared to be an ordinary electrical box. When pulled, there was a grinding sound of long unused gears, and a section of the floor began to retract, revealing a sloping driveway leading down into darkness. Heart pounding, Sarah aimed her lantern down the ramp. The beam of light reflected off something metallic in the darkness below. Cautiously, she made her way down the sloped concrete, the air growing cooler as she descended about 15 feet below the main floor level. What she found left her breathless. The hidden space was enormous, at least 5,000 square feet, nearly twice the size of the visible shop above. And it was filled with cars, not just any cars, but some of the rarest and most valuable vintage automobiles Sarah had ever seen outside of a museum. A 1937 Bugatti Type 57 SC Atalante, one of only a handful known to exist. A 1954 Mercedes-Benz 300 SL Gullwing. A 1962 Ferrari 250 GTO, a model that had recently sold at auction for over $48 million. In 1955, Porsche 550 Spider, similar to the one James Dean had been driving when he died, and at least a dozen other vehicles, each worth millions to the right collector, all preserved in climate-controlled conditions. Sarah moved between the cars. In a state of shock, her journalist's mind automatically cataloging details. Each vehicle appeared to be in pristine condition, as if they had been carefully maintained despite being hidden away. Beside each car was a binder containing its complete history, original purchase documents, service records, and historical photographs. In the center of the room stood a workbench with a leather-bound ledger. With trembling hands, Sarah opened it to find Frank Mitchell's meticulous handwriting detailing each acquisition. According to the notes, he'd been quietly collecting and restoring these automobiles since the 1960s, many purchased when they were merely used cars rather than priceless classics. The final entry, dated just 2 weeks before his death, read, "Collection now complete. 17 vehicles, total value estimated at 35 to 40 million based on recent auctions. Instructions for discovery and safe." Sarah sank onto a nearby stool, overwhelmed by the implications. She had stumbled upon an automotive treasure trove worth more money than she could comprehend. But why had Frank Mitchell hidden these cars away? And what did he mean by instructions for discovery? As questions raced through her mind, one thing became abundantly clear. Her life had just changed forever. After the initial shock subsided, Sarah spent hours examining each vehicle, her automotive expertise allowing her to appreciate not just their monetary value, but their historical significance. These weren't randomly collected expensive cars. They told a story of automotive evolution. Through the 20th century, carefully curated examples of engineering milestones and design. In the underground chamber, Sarah's journalistic instincts took over despite her amazement. She began photographing everything, each vehicle, the documentation folders, the ledger entries, creating a meticulous record of her discovery. The collection was more significant than just its monetary value. It represented a carefully preserved automotive timeline, with each car in remarkable condition. The 1937 Bugatti's flowing curves gleamed under her lantern light, its midnight blue paintwork still immaculate. She ran her fingers gently over the hood, feeling the craftsmanship that had gone into creating this masterpiece of French engineering. The car had been considered lost to history, with automotive historians speculating it had been destroyed during World War II. Next to it, the Mercedes Gullwing's iconic doors reached toward the ceiling. Sarah carefully opened one, revealing an interior that smelled faintly of original leather. The car's documents indicated it had been purchased from a Hollywood producer in 1972 for $14,500, a price that seemed laughable now, considering recent examples had sold for over $2 million. The Ferrari 250 GTO took her breath away. Only 36 were ever built, and this red example was chassis number 3451 GT, a car that had competed at Le Mans in 1962 and had been reported missing from the collector community since the late 1970s. Its presence alone made the collection internationally significant. As Sarah moved through the space, she noticed something peculiar. Each vehicle had been positioned precisely, with exactly the same distance between them, arranged chronologically. The lighting system, though currently off, had been designed to illuminate each car individually. This wasn't just storage. It was a private museum, created by someone with profound reverence for automotive history. In one corner stood a small desk with a vintage typewriter. Beside it, a metal safe was built into the wall. This must be where Mitchell had kept the instructions for discovery mentioned in his ledger. Sarah examined the safe, an old Mosler model with a combination dial. She tried several obvious combinations based on dates from the ledger, but nothing worked. The enormity of her situation began to sink in. She had unknowingly purchased what could be the most valuable barn find in automotive history, but with this discovery came questions and responsibilities. Who was Frank Mitchell really? Why had he hidden these treasures? Was she even the legal owner of these vehicles, or were they stolen or obtained through questionable means? Sarah returned to the main floor, securing the hidden door behind her. Her modest sleeping area in the apartment above the shop now seemed incongruous with the fortune that lay beneath her feet. She needed to think carefully about her next steps. Sleep eluded her that night as questions raced through her mind. By morning, she had decided on a cautious approach. Before informing anyone of her discovery, she needed to understand more about Frank Mitchell and the legal status of the collection. The Millfield Town Library was housed in a Victorian building on Main Street, The librarian, a woman in her 60s with silver-rimmed glasses and a cardigan despite the June heat, looked up with interest when Sarah introduced herself. "You're the one who bought old Mitchell's place," she said, her tone suggesting this was noteworthy gossip in their small community. "Bold move. That building's been sitting empty since Frank passed. I'm trying to learn more about him," Sarah explained. "Do you have any local newspapers from that time, or anyone who might have known him well?" The librarian, Margaret, according to her name tag, considered this. Frank wasn't exactly social, especially in his later years, but we do have archives of the Millfield Gazette going back decades. And, she hesitated, "My husband Tom did some electrical work for Frank back in the 90s, said it was the strangest job he ever had. Frank made him wear a blindfold when entering certain parts of the building." This confirmed Sarah's suspicions that Mitchell had been protecting his secret collection even from local tradespeople. Margaret led her to a microfilm reader, where Sarah spent hours scrolling through local history. Frank Mitchell appeared occasionally in community news. His shop had opened in 1958 after he returned from military service. He was described as a skilled mechanic who specialized in European vehicles, drawing clients from as far away as New York and Boston. There were no mentions of a family or close associates. His obituary was brief, noting only his age, 78, and business, with no listed survivors. More interesting was what Sarah found in a 1974 article. Mitchell had been briefly questioned in connection with the disappearance of a rare Jaguar from a collector in Connecticut. The car had never been recovered, and Mitchell was never charged. But the article mentioned he had been cleared under unusual circumstances. Sarah also discovered references to Mitchell's occasional trips abroad, particularly to Europe in the 1960s and 70s, unusual for a small-town mechanic in that era. One photograph showed him at a car auction in Monaco in 1969, standing near a Ferrari similar to the one in his underground collection. As Sarah prepared to leave, Margaret approached with a business card. "If you're serious about learning more about Frank, you should talk to Claire Donahue. She owns the diner on Elm Street. She and Frank were close at one point. Only person he ever let into his inner circle, as far as anyone knows." The Millfield Diner was a classic 1950s establishment, with chrome fixtures and red vinyl booths. Claire Donahue was immediately recognizable behind the counter, a striking woman in her late 60s with sharp eyes and silver hair pulled into a practical bun. She moved with the efficiency of someone who had run a busy restaurant for decades. When the lunch rush subsided, Sarah introduced herself. Claire's expression shifted subtly at the mention of Frank Mitchell's property. "So you're the new owner," she said, studying Sarah with undisguised curiosity. "Coffee's on the house, then. Not many people would take on that old place." Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully. "I'm trying to understand more about Frank. The property has some unusual features." Claire glanced around to ensure no customers needed her attention, then slid into the booth across from Sarah. "You found something, didn't you?" Her direct approach caught Sarah off guard. "Frank always said someone would, eventually. That was the point." "The point of what?" Sarah asked carefully. Claire sighed, her gaze distant with memory. "Frank and I were engaged once back in 1972, but his collection became more important than anything else. He was obsessed with preserving automotive history, creating this perfect time capsule. Said he was saving treasures that the world wasn't appreciating properly." "So, you knew about the cars?" Sarah kept her voice low. Claire nodded. "Some of them. He was already hiding them by the time I came along. Frank had this theory that true craftsmanship was disappearing from the automotive world, that mass production was erasing artistry. He wanted to preserve examples of the pinnacle of design and engineering. But why keep them secret? Why not open a museum or something public? Claire's laugh held little humor. Frank didn't trust institutions, believed they'd eventually sell off the important pieces or fail to maintain them properly. He'd seen too many collections dispersed, too many rare cars modified or neglected by owners who didn't understand their significance. She leaned forward, her voice dropping further. But there was more to it. Some of those cars, the way he acquired them wasn't always straightforward. Nothing illegal, mind you, but complicated. Cars with disputed ownership histories, vehicles from estates where heirs didn't understand their value, private deals with collectors facing financial ruin who wanted their treasures preserved rather than sold to the highest bidder. So what was his end game? Sarah asked. Keep them hidden forever? Claire shook her head. No, he had a plan. He wanted them found, but only by the right person at the right time, someone who would understand their importance beyond their price tags. She studied Sarah thoughtfully. He set it up like a test, said the right steward would solve the puzzle. Yay! The safe, Sarah murmured. There are instructions in a safe. Claire seemed unsurprised that Sarah had found this much already. The combination would be something meaningful to him, something connected to the cars themselves. As Claire was called back to the counter by a customer, she left Sarah with a parting thought. Frank was odd, but he wasn't crazy. Everything had a purpose, including how and when these cars would return to the world. If you're the one who found them, maybe you're meant to be part of that purpose. Sarah returned to the property with her mind spinning. The sun was setting as she pulled up to the weathered building that now felt different. Not just a dilapidated shop, but the guardian of a remarkable secret. Inside, she descended again to the underground chamber, this time bringing better lighting. In the improved illumination, she noticed details she'd missed before. On one wall hung framed black and white photographs. Frank Mitchell as a young man standing next to various cars, many of which were now in his collection. In one photo from what appeared to be the 1950s, he stood proudly beside a racing team, wearing mechanic's overalls. Sarah examined the safe again, considering Claire's hint about the combination. If it related to the cars themselves, what numbers would Mitchell have chosen? Manufacture years? Chassis numbers? Production quantities? She tried several combinations, without success. Then, looking around the room at the careful arrangement of vehicles, she noticed they formed a specific timeline from 1936 to 1969. 17 cars spanning 33 years of automotive evolution. On a hunch, she tried 17 to 33, 58. The number of cars, the span of years they covered, and the year Mitchell opened his shop. The safe remained locked. Sarah sat at the small desk, frustrated. Her eyes fell on a faded photograph of Mitchell standing beside the Ferrari GTO. He was younger there, maybe in his 40s, with a stopwatch around his neck. The photo appeared to be from a race, and Mitchell was pointing proudly at the car's number, 25, the Ferrari's racing number. Could it be that simple? Sarah moved to each car, noting any racing numbers visible on their documentation. 5 cars had period-correct racing numbers applied: 25, 17, 11, 9, and 3. She tried the combination 25 to 17, 11. Nothing. Then she remembered something from her automotive history knowledge. These particular numbers weren't random in racing. They corresponded to qualifying positions. The lower the number, the faster the car. She tried again, 3, 9, 11. The safe dial clicked and the heavy door swung open. Inside was a single envelope addressed simply to the finder and a small box. Sarah opened the envelope with trembling hands, unfolding several typewritten pages. "If you are reading this," the letter began, "then you have discovered what I consider my life's true work. My name is Franklin Mitchell, though in another life I was Francesco Martinelli, a mechanic for Scuderia Ferrari from 1953 to 1957. Sarah gasped. This explained his expertise and connections, but raised even more questions. The letter continued, detailing how Mitchell had changed his identity after leaving Italy following a dispute with Enzo Ferrari himself. He had come to America and established his shop, using his connections and knowledge to begin quietly acquiring significant cars. These vehicles represent the pinnacle of human craftsmanship and innovation, Mitchell wrote. Each tells a story of its era, of the men who designed it, built it, and raced it. I did not collect them for their monetary value, but for their cultural significance. They are artifacts that deserve preservation as meticulously as any painting by Rembrandt or sculpture by Michelangelo. Mitchell explained that he had intentionally withdrawn these cars from circulation to protect them from being modified, damaged in races, or stripped for parts. His goal was to preserve them in their original condition for future generations. I have no heirs of my blood, the letter continued, so I have arranged for these automobiles to be discovered by someone worthy of carrying forward their legacy. If you have solved the puzzles to reach this point, you have demonstrated the combination of automotive knowledge, curiosity, and persistence that suggests you might be that person. The letter's final pages contained detailed legal information. Mitchell had established a trust before his death, with provisions for whoever discovered the collection. The property and all its contents would legally transfer to this person, provided they agreed to specific conditions. The collection must be kept intact, the cars maintained in their original condition, and they must eventually be made accessible to the public in some form. The small box contained the trust documents, already prepared by Mitchell's attorneys, needing only Sarah's signature and notarization to transfer ownership. Also inside was a key to a safe deposit box at Millfield National Bank, containing all original ownership documentation for each vehicle. Sarah sat in stunned silence, processing Mitchell's extraordinary story and the responsibility he was offering her. She had come to Millfield desperate and nearly broke. Now she was being entrusted with an automotive collection worth tens of millions of dollars, not to sell but to preserve and share. As dawn broke the following morning, Sarah made her way to the Millfield National Bank with the key and trust documents. The bank manager, initially skeptical, became increasingly astonished as he verified the legitimate paperwork. The safe deposit box contained exactly what Mitchell had promised: complete provenance for each vehicle, along with insurance documentation and maintenance records. "Ms. Williams," the manager said finally, "it appears you've inherited quite a responsibility. Frank Mitchell was a peculiar man, but it seems he knew exactly what he was doing." Over the next week, Sarah consulted with attorneys specializing in estate law and automotive collections. The trust Mitchell had established was ironclad. The collection was indeed hers to steward, provided she maintained it according to his wishes. The lawyers assured her that Mitchell had obtained each vehicle legally, though sometimes through unconventional channels. The trust also included a modest endowment for initial maintenance and insurance costs. As word of her discovery began to spread within specialized circles of the automotive world, Sarah's phone started ringing constantly. Museum curators, auction houses, and wealthy collectors all wanted access to the vehicles that had been considered lost for decades. One call particularly stood out, from Marcus Harrington, director of the National Automotive Heritage Museum in Detroit. "Miss Williams," his voice conveyed barely contained excitement, "if what I'm hearing is true, you've discovered perhaps the most significant private collection of the last 50 years. Several of those vehicles were thought to be lost forever." "That's what I'm gathering," Sarah replied, still feeling overwhelmed by the situation. "The Ferrari GTO alone..." Harrington paused, composing himself. "We've been documenting that particular chassis number for years. It vanished after its racing career ended in 1964. Automotive historians have been searching for it for decades. It's here, Sarah confirmed, along with 16 other vehicles, all in remarkable condition. I'd like to send our conservation team to assess the collection, Harrington proposed. Not to acquire it, I understand the trust restrictions, but to document it properly and ensure the vehicles are being maintained correctly. This is a historically significant find, Ms. Williams. Sarah agreed to the assessment, recognizing her need for expert assistance. Within days, a team of specialists arrived, their expressions of awe confirming the extraordinary nature of what she had inherited. Dr. Eleanor Contreras, the museum's head of vehicle conservation, spent hours examining each car. "These aren't just preserved," she explained to Sarah as they stood beside the Bugatti. "They've been maintained. Mitchell must have started the engines regularly, rotated the tires, preserved the leather. This isn't the work of a hoarder or even just a collector. This was someone who understood these machines as living artifacts." The assessment confirmed what Sarah had begun to suspect. Frank Mitchell hadn't been eccentric so much as visionary. He had recognized the historical importance of these vehicles long before the collector market caught up, preserving them when others were still modifying classic cars without concern for originality. As the experts catalogued the collection, Sarah found herself at a crossroads. The trust gave her significant latitude in how to make the collection accessible to the public. She could partner with an existing museum, create her own facility, or develop a traveling exhibition. Each option had merits and challenges. More pressing was her immediate financial situation. While the trust provided for the car's maintenance, it didn't address her personal needs. She had spent nearly all her inheritance on the property and had no income. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was simultaneously responsible for millions in automotive treasures while wondering how she'd pay for groceries. During a late-night conversation with Megan, Sarah voiced her frustrations. "I can't sell the cars. Not that I would want to, but I need to find a way to make this sustainable. Mitchell clearly wanted these preserved, but he also wanted them shared. There has to be a way to honor both intentions." "What about your journalism background?" Megan suggested. "These cars must have amazing stories. People would pay to hear those stories, especially coming from someone with your expertise." The idea resonated with Sarah. Each vehicle in the collection had a fascinating history, the races it had won, the innovations it had pioneered, the cultural impact it had made. These were stories worth telling. A plan began to form. Sarah spent the next morning drafting a business plan, her journalist's mind organizing the possibilities systematically. The property itself offered significant advantages. Rural enough for privacy, but only 90 minutes from Boston, with adequate space for a small museum and event center. The main building would need substantial renovation, but the underground facility was already a perfect showroom. She calculated startup costs, potential revenue streams, and marketing strategies. By mid-afternoon, she had the skeleton of a viable plan. Mitchell's Legacy, Museum of Automotive Excellence. She would transform the repair shop into a boutique automotive museum, offering limited, reservation-only tours to serious enthusiasts and collectors. The exclusivity would allow her to charge premium prices while maintaining the security and preservation standards the collection required. Beyond basic admission, she envisioned specialized experiences, private viewings for automotive photographers, educational workshops on car history and design, and exclusive events for auto clubs and collector groups. Her journalism connections could help generate initial publicity, and the mysterious story of Frank Mitchell's hidden collection would provide a compelling narrative hook. As Sarah refined her plan, a black Mercedes SUV pulled into the gravel driveway. A man in his 50s emerged, dressed in an expensive suit that seemed out of place in rural Millfield. He approached with confident strides, surveying the property with undisguised interest. "Miss Williams, Thomas Blackwell." He introduced himself with a practiced smile. "I represent Pinnacle Automotive Acquisitions. May I have a moment of your time?" Sarah hadn't publicized her discovery beyond the museum experts, but it seemed news had traveled through collector circles nonetheless. She invited him inside, curious about his approach. The main shop area was still dusty and disorganized. Deliberately so. Sarah had decided not to reveal the underground collection to visitors until she had proper security in place. Blackwell looked around with barely concealed disappointment. "I understand you've recently acquired this property," he began, maintaining his smile despite the surroundings. "My clients specialize in purchasing unique automotive assets. We'd be prepared to make a very generous offer for the entire property, sight unseen." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Sight unseen? That seems unusual, Mr. Blackwell." "Let's be frank." His tone shifted to business-like efficiency. "We know about Mitchell's collection. The 250 GTO alone would interest my clients considerably. We're prepared to offer $15 million for the entire property and contents, cash transaction, completed within a week." The figure was deliberately impressive. Far more than Sarah had paid, but significantly less than the collection's true value. Just the Ferrari could command that price at auction. "That's a substantial offer," Sarah replied carefully. "But I'm afraid the collection isn't for sale. The trust has specific provisions about keeping it intact." Blackwell's smile tightened. "Perhaps I wasn't clear about my client's resources. We could go to 20 million. That would solve any financial concerns you might have about maintaining these vehicles properly." "It's not about the money, Mr. Blackwell. Frank Mitchell preserved these cars for a reason. I intend to honor his wishes." Blackwell's cordial demeanor slipped slightly. "Ms. Williams, be reasonable. You're a journalist, not a museum curator or collector. Do you truly believe you're equipped to manage artifacts of this significance? My clients have facilities, expertise, and resources you simply don't possess." His condescension ignited something in Sarah. "Thank you for your concerns, but my decision stands. The collection stays intact and remains here, as Mitchell intended." After Blackwell departed with thinly veiled frustration, Sarah realized she needed to accelerate her security preparations. Word was spreading faster than she'd anticipated. That evening, as Sarah reviewed renovation estimates in the apartment, above the shop, she heard a vehicle approaching. Concerned after Blackwell's visit, she moved cautiously to the window. A pickup truck had parked alongside the building, its headlights off. A woman emerged, middle-aged, casually dressed, moving with purpose toward the shop entrance. Sarah met her at the door before she could knock. "We're closed," she said firmly, though the sign had been removed years ago. The woman seemed unsurprised by Sarah's appearance. "Rebecca Mitchell," she introduced herself. "I believe you've met my uncle's collection." Sarah stared in shock. "Mitchell's niece? He mentioned no family in his letter." "He wouldn't have," Rebecca acknowledged with a rueful smile. "Frank and my father had a complicated relationship. But I grew up visiting this shop until their falling out in the 80s. I've been watching this place since he died, waiting to see if anyone would solve his puzzle." Cautiously, Sarah invited her inside, still uncertain whether to trust this unexpected relative. "If you knew about the collection, why didn't you claim it?" The terms of Frank's trust were clear. The finder becomes the keeper, provided they meet his conditions. "I respected his wishes," Rebecca explained, following Sarah into the shop. "Besides, he and I had an understanding. I check on the property occasionally, make sure everything remains secure." "So you have access to the underground garage?" Sarah asked, surprised. Rebecca shook her head. "No, I've never been inside. Frank reconfigured the entrance after my father and he stopped speaking. I just make sure the external systems remain operational. The climate control, security measures, power backup. They run on a separate grid from the main building. This explained why the collection remained in pristine condition despite the shop's abandonment. Mitchell had engineered systems to preserve his treasures indefinitely. "Why come forward now?" Sarah questioned. "Because Thomas Blackwell visited you today," Rebecca stated matter-of-factly. "He's approached every owner of a significant car collection in New England. His clients aren't collectors. They're investors who purchase rare automobiles, hold them briefly in climate-controlled warehouses, then flip them for profit. They dismantle my uncle's life's work in months." Sarah hesitated, then decided to trust her instincts. "Would you like to see what your uncle created?" Rebecca's eyes widened as Sarah led her to the hidden entrance and activated the mechanism. As the wall slid open, revealing the ramp downward, Rebecca gasped softly. "He actually did it. All those years, my father said Frank was wasting his money and expertise, called his collection an obsession, a fantasy." When they entered the underground chamber, Rebecca moved through the space reverently, occasionally brushing tears from her eyes. "I recognized some of these from when I was a child. That Jaguar, Frank let me sit in it once. Told me it was magic because it could transport me to a different time." She paused before the Ferrari GTO. "This one he called his masterpiece, said it represented everything right about automotive design before computers took over. Your uncle left very specific instructions about preserving them," Sarah explained, showing her Mitchell's letter. Rebecca read it carefully, nodding occasionally. "This sounds exactly like him. Stubborn, meticulous, but passionate about these machines in a way few people could understand." She looked up at Sarah. He was right. To set it up this way, if the collection had gone to family, my cousins would have sold it immediately. They never understood why he lived so modestly when he owned cars worth millions. "Do you know anything about his past?" The letter mentions he was originally Francesco Martinelli, a Ferrari mechanic. Rebecca smiled. That part of his history was real, though rarely discussed. He fled Italy after some dispute with Enzo Ferrari, something about race car modifications that Ferrari rejected but later adopted. Frank felt betrayed, came to America, and reinvented himself. His knowledge of European cars made his reputation in this region. Collectors from all over the Northeast brought their vehicles to him. "And the cars here, were they acquired legitimately?" Sarah asked the question that had been concerning her. "As far as I know," Rebecca confirmed, "Frank had an unusual procurement method. He would find cars with significant histories that had fallen into neglect or ownership by people who didn't appreciate them. He'd approach with cash offers, typically, fair but not excessive. His reputation for meticulous care meant many sellers preferred him to unknown buyers, even at slightly lower prices. But why hide them completely? Some of these have been considered lost for decades." Rebecca considered this thoughtfully. "I believe he was creating something he thought automotive museums couldn't. A perfectly preserved time capsule of excellence. No compromises, no commercial pressures, just the vehicles exactly as they were in their prime." She gestured around the space. "This isn't just a collection, it's a statement about perfection and preservation." As they talked into the evening, Sarah shared her plans for converting the property into a museum. Rebecca offered insights about her uncle's vision and practical suggestions based on her own experience as an architectural preservationist. "I could help," she proposed. "I have contacts in historical preservation, experience with grant applications for cultural landmarks, and knowledge of period-appropriate renovation techniques. Plus," she added with a smile, "I'm probably the only person besides you who understands what these cars meant to Frank." By midnight, their partnership had taken shape. Rebecca would assist with the renovation and historical aspects, while Sarah would leverage her automotive journalism background for content development and promotion. Together, they could create something that honored Mitchell's legacy while making it accessible to those who would appreciate it. The following weeks passed in a flurry of activity. Sarah used a small portion of the Trust's maintenance fund to begin essential repairs to the main building. Rebecca introduced her to preservation specialists who could restore the 1950s character of the shop while updating its functionality. They installed proper security systems and improved the private access to the underground collection. Word continued to spread through automotive circles. Sarah received inquiries from collectors, museums, and auction houses worldwide. Thomas Blackwell returned twice, each time with increasingly generous offers and thinly veiled warnings about the difficulties of managing such valuable assets without proper resources. 25 million, Ms. Williams, he stated during his third visit. My client's final offer. Consider your position carefully. Maintaining these vehicles properly requires expertise and funding you simply don't have. Sarah stood firm. Mr. Blackwell, I've said this before. The collection isn't for sale at any price. Please stop wasting both our time. As Blackwell departed, his parting words carried an unmistakable threat. You'll find the collector world can be quite insular, Ms. Williams. Those who don't play by established rules often find themselves excluded. True to his warning, Sarah soon encountered unexpected obstacles. Insurance companies suddenly found reasons to deny coverage for the museum project. Contractors reported scheduling conflicts. Local permits faced unusual delays. It became clear that Blackwell's clients had considerable influence and were using it to pressure her. During this challenging period, Claire Donahue proved an unexpected ally. Her diner became Sarah and Rebecca's unofficial headquarters, and her long-standing position in the community helped overcome local resistance to their project. Frank would be laughing himself silly right now, Claire remarked one evening as they reviewed revised permit applications. He always said the car world was full of sharks and Italian loafers who thought everything had a price tag. Despite the opposition, the project moved forward. Sarah initiated a carefully controlled publicity campaign, releasing teaser information about a significant automotive discovery in New England to selected journalists. The resulting speculation generated precisely the mystique she wanted to establish. Dr. Contreras from the National Automotive Heritage Museum remained supportive, providing conservation advice and authenticating the collection's provenance. Under her guidance, Sarah and Rebecca developed proper maintenance protocols for each vehicle. 6 months after her impulsive purchase at the county auction, Sarah stood in the transformed main building of what would soon open as Mitchell's Legacy. The repair shop had been restored to its 1950s appearance, with vintage tools and equipment displayed alongside period photographs and automotive memorabilia. Interactive exhibits explained the mechanical innovations represented by the collection. Below, the underground chamber remained largely as Mitchell had designed it, with improved lighting and discrete informational displays added. Each car now had its story professionally presented, connecting it to broader automotive history and cultural context. The Ferrari GTO occupied the central position, recognized as the collection's centerpiece both financially and historically. Sarah had devised a unique visitation model. Rather than daily public access, the museum would offer limited, curated experiences, small group tours led by automotive experts, private viewings for serious enthusiasts, and educational programs for selected engineering and design students. This approach maintained the exclusivity Mitchell had valued while sharing his legacy with those who would truly appreciate it. 2 days before the invitation-only opening event, Sarah received an unexpected call from Marcus Harrington at the National Automotive Heritage Museum. Ms. Williams, We've been approached by someone claiming questionable provenance for the Ferrari GTO in your collection. They're suggesting it was improperly acquired in the 1960s and rightfully belongs to the descendants of an Italian racing team owner. Sarah's stomach tightened. That's impossible. Dr. Contreras authenticated all the documentation. Mitchell's records show a legal purchase in 1964. I believe you, Harrington assured her. This has Blackwell's fingerprints all over it. He's done this before, creating ownership controversies to pressure sellers. But I should warn you, even baseless claims can create legal entanglements that drain resources and create publicity. Nightmares. After consulting with her attorneys, Sarah realized she needed to address this threat directly. She arranged a meeting with Blackwell at a neutral location, a conference room at the Millfield Inn. He arrived with 2 associates and an air of satisfaction. Reconsidering our offer, Ms. Williams. $25 million still stands, though. These new questions about the Ferrari's provenance might affect valuation. Actually, I have something to show you, Sarah replied calmly, opening a folder. Inside were photographs, black and white images from the 1960s, showing a younger Frank Mitchell with various racing figures, including Enzo Ferrari himself. These are from Mitchell's personal archives, which I've been cataloging. Notice the dates and the people. Blackwell examined them with growing unease. Mitchell, or Martinelli as he was known then, was directly connected to Ferrari's racing program. He personally supervised that GTO during its competition career, Sarah continued. But more relevant to your claims, I have this. She produced a yellowed document with official seals. The original bill of sale, signed by the team owner himself, the very person whose descendants you claim never received payment. There are also banking records confirming the wire transfer. She leaned forward. Mr. Blackwell, I've spent my career researching automotive history. Did you really think I wouldn't thoroughly investigate the provenance of each vehicle? Every car in that collection has complete, verifiable documentation. Your manufactured controversy will only embarrass your clients. Blackwell maintained his composed expression, but his associates shifted uncomfortably. These could be forgeries, he suggested weakly. They've already been authenticated by 3 independent experts, Sarah countered. And tomorrow, copies go to every major automotive publication and museum, along with a detailed account of your attempts to pressure me into selling. Now we can end this properly, or I can ensure your clients understand exactly how their representative and conducts business. The threat of exposure to the tight-knit collector community proved effective. By evening, Sarah received confirmation that the provenance challenge had been withdrawn. Blackwell's clients, wealthy but image-conscious, had decided to distance themselves from the controversy. The grand opening of Mitchell's legacy proceeded as planned. The invited guests, museum curators, automotive journalists, respected collectors and local officials, reacted with astonishment as they descended into the underground gallery. Even those familiar with elite collections were visibly moved by the combination of exceptional vehicles and the story of Mitchell's lifetime mission to preserve them. Car and Driver magazine's senior editor summarized the general reaction. What Mitchell created here transcends collecting. It's automotive, archaeology, preserving not just machines but moments in design and engineering history, each in its perfect original state. Williams and Mitchell have created something unique in the automotive world, a collection with a soul. The limited access model proved immediately successful. Reservations for private viewings filled months in advance. Engineering programs from major universities requested special access for student groups. Documentary filmmakers proposed series exploring the stories behind individual vehicles. For Sarah, the most meaningful moment came during a quiet evening after the crowds had departed. Standing alone in the underground chamber, surrounded by Mitchell's treasures, she felt a profound sense of purpose. From near homelessness to becoming the custodian of automotive history, her life had transformed completely in less than a year. Rebecca found her there, contemplating the Bugatti in the soft lighting. "You know," Rebecca said, joining her, "I've been thinking about why Frank set up his elaborate discovery system. It wasn't just eccentricity." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked. "He could have simply left the collection to a museum or established a conventional trust. Instead, he created this test, the hidden entrance, the coded safe, all of it designed to ensure the finder would possess certain qualities: curiosity, persistence, automotive knowledge." Rebecca smiled at Sarah. "He was looking for someone like you. Someone who would see these cars as he did, not just as valuable objects, but as cultural treasures worth preserving for their own sake." This perspective resonated with Sarah. She hadn't simply found Mitchell's collection. In some sense, it had found her, the right person at the right moment to continue its story. The autumn winds swept through Millfield, bringing a chill that signaled the changing seasons. Sarah stood on the newly repaired porch of Mitchell's legacy, watching as workers installed the handcrafted wooden sign above the entrance. The weathered blue paint of the building had been restored to its original luster, and the gravel driveway was now properly graded and lined with vintage-appropriate lighting fixtures. What had once been an abandoned, dilapidated structure had been transformed into a distinctive landmark that perfectly balanced historical accuracy with subtle modern improvements. The grand opening of Mitchell's legacy was scheduled for the following weekend, almost 8 months since Sarah had impulsively purchased the property at auction. The invitation-only event had generated considerable buzz in the automotive world, with confirmed attendees from major museums, publications, and private collections across the country. Even several European automotive historians had arranged travel to witness the unveiling of Frank Mitchell's long-hidden treasures. As Sarah turned to go back inside, a sleek black Porsche pulled into the driveway, parking beside the construction vehicles. A tall woman in her early 60s emerged, her silver hair cut in a stylish bob, her movements confident and purposeful. She surveyed the building with obvious interest before approaching Sarah. "Impressive restoration," she commented, extending her hand. "Judith Harrington, European Auto Quarterly. I was hoping for a preview before the crowds descend." Sarah recognized the name immediately. Judith Harrington was among the most respected automotive historians in the field, known for her authoritative books on European racing marques and her uncanny ability to trace the provenance of vehicles previously thought lost to history. "Ms. Harrington, it's an honor," Sarah replied, shaking her hand. "I've read all your books. Your work on documenting the surviving Bugatti Atlantics was incredibly detailed." Judith smiled, pleased at the recognition. "When I heard about your discovery, I had to see it for myself. Frank Mitchell was something of a legend among serious collectors, the mechanic who could fix anything but who rarely sold his services to just anyone. There were always rumors about his private collection, but nothing concrete until now." Sarah led her inside, past the workers finishing the main floor exhibits. "How did you hear about us so quickly? We've been trying to keep the details relatively quiet until the opening." "The automotive world is smaller than you might think," Judith replied, "when 17 significant cars suddenly resurface after decades, people notice, especially when one of them is a Ferrari 250 GTO that's been missing since 1964. They descended to the underground chamber, where Rebecca was supervising the installation of discrete information panels beside each vehicle. The space had been improved with better lighting and climate control, but remained largely as Mitchell had designed it, a temple to automotive excellence. Judith moved through the collection with the reverence of someone who truly understood its significance, occasionally murmuring appreciative comments or asking penetrating questions about specific details. When she reached the Ferrari GTO, she circled it slowly, her expression growing increasingly perplexed. "This is extraordinary," she finally said. "Not just the car itself, but its condition. Most GTOs from this period have been restored multiple times, their originality compromised. This one..." She knelt to examine the undercarriage. "This one is untouched except for essential mechanical maintenance. The patina is genuine." Mitchell was fanatical about preservation, Sarah explained. According to his journals, he believed over-restoration destroyed the soul of a vehicle. He maintained them mechanically, but preserved their original finishes, whenever possible. Judith straightened, fixing Sarah with an intense gaze. "Do you realize what you have here? This collection, preserved this way with documented provenance and a single caretaker for decades. It's unprecedented. Museums acquire individual vehicles of significance, but a cohesive collection like this, telling a specific story of automotive evolution through a connoisseur's eye, this is a cultural treasure." Her praise was gratifying, but Sarah sensed there was more to Judith's interest than professional curiosity. "You didn't come all this way just to preview the collection, did you?" Judith laughed softly. "Perceptive. No, I didn't." She glanced toward Rebecca, who was still engaged with the installation team across the room. "I came because I need to warn you. Your discovery has attracted attention from people who believe some of these cars rightfully belong elsewhere." "Blackwell's clients?" Sarah asked, referring to the acquisition specialist who had pressured her earlier. "Among others. Thomas Blackwell represents collectors who want to own these treasures, but there are more complex interests involved now." Judith lowered her voice. "Several European manufacturers, including Ferrari, are preparing heritage claims. They'll argue that vehicles of particular historical significance belong in their corporate collections, regardless of legal ownership." Sarah frowned. "Mitchell acquired these cars legitimately. We have the documentation." "Documentation can be challenged, particularly for vehicles that changed hands during chaotic periods. The Ferrari, for instance, disappeared after the 1964 racing season when the team was in transition. The Bugatti crossed borders multiple times during a period when record-keeping was inconsistent." Judith's expression was sympathetic but serious. "I've seen this before. Corporations with deep pockets can create legitimate-seeming provenance disputes that drain smaller owners financially, forcing them to settle." "Why are you telling me this?" Sarah asked, suddenly wary. "Are you representing someone?" "I'm representing history," Judith replied firmly. "I've spent my career documenting and authenticating automotive heritage. What matters is that these vehicles are preserved and their stories told accurately." She handed Sarah a business card. "I'm offering my services as a provenance consultant. If claims emerge, you'll need someone who knows how to counter them effectively." Before Sarah could respond, Rebecca approached, having finished with the installation team. After introductions, the three women continued touring the collection, with Judith providing fascinating context about each vehicle's place in automotive history. Her knowledge was impressive and her passion genuine, but Sarah remained cautious about the warning and offer. After Judith departed, Sarah shared the conversation with Rebecca. "Do you think she's right about potential claims against the collection?" Rebecca considered this thoughtfully. "It's possible. The automotive world can be surprisingly contentious when it comes to historically significant vehicles. But I'm more curious about her timing. How did she know so much about our collection before the public unveiling? The details weren't in any of our press materials." This question lingered as they continued preparations for the opening. Sarah instructed their attorneys to review Mitchell's acquisition documentation once more, ensuring everything was properly organized if challenges emerged. Meanwhile, advance ticket reservations for the limited access museum were filling rapidly, confirming their business model's viability. 3 days before the opening, Sarah received a formal letter from Ferrari's heritage department requesting a meeting to discuss the historical significance of chassis number 3451 GT and potential collaborative opportunities. The language was cordial, but carried an undercurrent of corporate authority that concerned her. Judith's warning suddenly seemed prescient. That same afternoon, a vintage Bentley pulled into the driveway. The driver, an elegantly dressed gentleman, in his 70s, introduced himself as Roland Winters, former racing driver and current director of the European Automotive Heritage Foundation. "Ms. Williams," he began after pleasantries were exchanged, "I understand you've been contacted by Ferrari regarding the GTO." When Sarah acknowledged this with surprise, he smiled knowingly. "Word travels quickly in our circles. I've come to offer an alternative perspective before you meet with them." Over tea in what had once been Mitchell's customer waiting area, now converted to a small reception space, Winters explained his position. "Corporate museums serve primarily as marketing tools," he stated bluntly. "Vehicles in their collections are presented to enhance brand prestige, not necessarily to tell accurate historical stories. Independent collections like yours are vital for preserving unfiltered automotive history." "You think Ferrari wants to acquire our GTO?" Sarah asked. "They'll frame it differently, perhaps as a loan, a traveling exhibition, or a research opportunity. But ultimately, they want control of the narrative surrounding significant cars from their racing heritage." Winters stirred his tea thoughtfully. "The European Automotive Heritage Foundation advocates for private collectors and independent museums. We can provide resources to help you maintain your independence." The offer seemed generous, but Sarah remained cautious. "What would your foundation want in return?" "Research access for our historians, occasional loan of vehicles for significant exhibitions, and your participation in our advocacy efforts for independent automotive collections." Winters smiled. "Nothing that compromises your ownership or Mitchell's vision." After Winters departed, Sarah found herself increasingly uncertain. Both Judith Harrington and Roland Winters had appeared unexpectedly, offering assistance against potential corporate incursions. Their concerns seemed legitimate, but their timing and detailed knowledge of her situation raised questions. The day before the museum's opening, representatives from Ferrari arrived. A distinguished older gentleman named Marco Bianchi, head of their heritage department, and a younger woman introduced as Eleanor Rossi, their legal counsel. Their manner was cordial, as Sarah showed them through the collection, though their attention clearly focused on the GTO. "You have created something remarkable here," Bianchi complimented as they stood beside the Ferrari. Frank Mitchell's preservation approach was decades ahead of its time. Today, we understand the value of unrestored, original condition vehicles, but in his era, most collectors preferred shiny restorations. "Thank you," Sarah replied. Mitchell believed these cars should remain as authentic as possible, functioning machines, but with their history visible in every detail. Bianchi nodded approvingly before shifting to their purpose. "Ms. Williams, Ferrari celebrates collectors who appreciate our heritage. However, certain vehicles have particular significance to our company's history. This GTO, chassis 3451 GT, was our most successful racing car in the 1964 season. Its development influenced multiple subsequent models." Eleanor Rossi continued smoothly, "We're not questioning Mr. Mitchell's ownership or your inheritance through his trust. Rather, we're proposing a partnership that benefits both parties." Ferrari would like to document this vehicle comprehensively for our historical archives. In exchange, we could provide technical support, maintenance expertise, and inclusion in our registry of significant Ferrari racing cars. The offer seemed reasonable on the surface. Ferrari wasn't demanding the car's return, but requesting access and offering support. However, Sarah noted specific language in the written proposal that gave her pause. The partnership would grant Ferrari ongoing curatorial input regarding the GTO's presentation and approval rights for any public statements about its racing history. This requires careful consideration, Sarah responded diplomatically. Our opening is tomorrow, and I wouldn't want to make decisions about any vehicle's future until we're fully established. The Ferrari representatives accepted this graciously, though Eleanor left behind a detailed partnership agreement for Sarah's review. "We understand your caution," Bianchi said as they departed. "Ferrari values its history and those who preserve it. We look forward to a productive relationship." After they left, Sarah examined the agreement more thoroughly. Though couched in collaborative language, it effectively gave Ferrari considerable control over one of the collection's most valuable assets. More concerning was a clause regarding historical authentication. Ferrari would become the official authenticator of the vehicle's racing provenance, with authority to correct historical misattributions. That evening, as final preparations for the opening concluded, Sarah found herself increasingly troubled by the competing interests surrounding the collection. Blackwell's clients wanted to purchase the vehicles outright. Ferrari sought control of their marca's historically significant cars. The European Automotive Heritage Foundation positioned itself as a defender of independent collections while requesting privileged access. Even Judith Harrington, while seemingly supportive, had appeared with suspiciously perfect timing. As Sarah locked up for the night, she noticed a figure standing in the shadows near the property's edge. Alarmed, she called out, her hand moving toward her phone to call for help. "Don't be frightened," a man's voice replied as he stepped into the light. He was elderly, perhaps in his 80s, dressed simply in work clothes. "I'm just an old mechanic paying my respects." "The museum isn't open yet," Sarah said cautiously. "The grand opening is tomorrow." The old man smiled gently. "I'm not here for the museum. I came to see what Frank's legacy has become." He looked up at the building with evident emotion. "I worked with him back in the 60s, before he became so private. Helped him acquire some of those beauties downstairs." Sarah's wariness gave way to curiosity. "You knew Frank Mitchell?" "Known him since we were apprentice mechanics together, long before he changed his name from Martinelli. I'm Joseph Salvatore." The name triggered recognition. Sarah had seen it in Mitchell's early journals, mentioned as a trusted friend who had helped import European vehicles. Joseph smiled at her recognition. "So he kept his records. Good." Frank was always meticulous. He gestured toward the shop. "May I see them? One last time before the crowds come." Something in his genuine emotion persuaded Sarah. She led him down to the underground chamber, watching as the elderly mechanic moved slowly among the vehicles, occasionally running a gnarled hand just above their surfaces, not quite touching, but communing with them nonetheless. "Beautiful," he murmured, stopping before the Ferrari. "We brought this one over in '64. Had to move it in secret. Too many questions about how it left the factory racing team. Nothing illegal, mind you, but complicated. Enzo Ferrari himself sold it privately to avoid corporate politics." This casual statement caught Sarah's attention. "Do you have any documentation of that transaction?" Ferrari's representatives are claiming special heritage rights because of its racing significance. Joseph chuckled. "Frank would have kept the proof. He never trusted corporate types. Check his personal files, not just the car documentation. He kept certain sensitive papers separate." Following this suggestion, Sarah and Joseph returned to Mitchell's office, now partially converted to the museum's administrative center. In the back of a filing cabinet behind folders of business receipts, they found a hidden compartment containing a leather portfolio. Inside were documents Sarah hadn't previously discovered, personal letters, confidential transaction records, and most significantly, a signed authorization from Enzo Ferrari himself, dated November 1964, approving the private sale of chassis 3451 GT to F. Martinelli as a gesture of appreciation for exceptional service to Scuderia Ferrari. "This changes everything," Sarah breathed, carefully examining the distinctive signature. Ferrari's historical claim is undermined by their founder's own actions. Joseph nodded. Enzo respected Frank's mechanical genius even after their professional disagreement. The GTO was essentially a parting gift, though money still changed hands. Frank considered it the cornerstone of his collection, proof that even the most significant vehicles should sometimes belong to passionate individuals rather than corporations. As Joseph prepared to leave, he offered Sarah one final piece of advice. All these people suddenly appearing, collectors, corporate representatives, foundations, they've known about Frank's collection for years. There were always rumors. They're coming now because you've made it public, and each has their own agenda. He fixed her with a serious gaze. Frank created his elaborate system to ensure his cars would be found by someone who appreciated them for the right reasons. Their historical significance, their engineering excellence, their beauty, not their monetary value or prestige. He would want you to maintain that independence. With that, the elderly mechanic departed, leaving Sarah with newfound determination and critical documentation. The following morning, opening day, she arranged emergency meetings with her legal team, Rebecca and Claire, from the diner, who had become an unofficial advisor due to her historical knowledge of Mitchell. Together, they crafted a response strategy. First, they digitized all of Mitchell's original documentation, including the newly discovered Ferrari authorization, creating secure backups. Next, they prepared a comprehensive provenance statement for each vehicle with multiple authentication sources cited. Finally, they revised the museum's mission statement to explicitly emphasize its status as an independent cultural institution, preserving automotive history free from corporate influence. When the doors opened that afternoon, Mitchell's legacy made an immediate impact on the automotive world. Journalists, historians, and collectors marveled at the remarkable preservation of the vehicles and the comprehensive documentation accompanying each one. The underground gallery, with its dramatic lighting and thoughtful presentation, transformed what could have been merely expensive cars into a cohesive historical narrative about automotive evolution. Sarah had arranged the guided tours personally, emphasizing Mitchell's philosophy throughout. "These aren't just valuable objects," she explained to the assembled VIPs. "They're cultural artifacts that tell us about engineering, design, racing heritage, and one man's dedication to preserving automotive excellence." Mitchell believed these stories belonged to everyone, not just corporations or wealthy collectors. When the Ferrari representatives approached her during the reception, Sarah was prepared. She quietly showed Marco Bianchi the newly discovered documentation from Enzo Ferrari himself. "We would still welcome Ferrari's technical expertise," she offered diplomatically, "but any partnership must respect the independent nature of this collection and Mitchell's vision. These vehicles tell honest, unfiltered stories about automotive history, including corporate politics, design compromises, and engineering disputes that official histories sometimes omit." Bianchi's surprise was evident, but his response was measured. Enzo's personal authorization. This is a significant historical document in itself. Perhaps we could discuss a different type of collaboration, one that acknowledges both Mitchell's legitimate ownership and Ferrari's interest in documenting our racing heritage. Similar conversations occurred with Roland Winters from the Heritage Foundation and Thomas Blackwell, whose clients had shifted from acquisition attempts to proposed sponsorship of special exhibitions. Each received the same message: Mitchell's legacy would remain independent, preserving automotive history without corporate influence or collector agendas. By evening, as the last guests departed, Sarah felt a profound sense of accomplishment. The opening had been more successful than she could have imagined, with advance bookings for the next 6 months secured and positive coverage from major automotive publications guaranteed. More importantly, she had established the museum's position as an autonomous cultural institution rather than a target for acquisition or control. Rebecca joined her in the underground gallery after the doors closed, carrying 2 glasses of champagne. "To Mitchell's legacy," she toasted, "and to finding your unexpected calling." Sarah smiled, accepting the glass. "When I bought this place with my inheritance, I was just trying to survive. I never imagined." She gestured around at the collection. "Any of this." "Frank Mitchell chose well," Rebecca observed. "He created a test that selected exactly the right person to carry on his work." As they celebrated quietly, Judith Harrington approached from the stairway. She had remained after the other guests left, examining documents in the research area. "Congratulations," she said, joining them. "You've accomplished something remarkable here. Not just preserving these vehicles, but establishing a new model for independent automotive collections." "Thank you," Sarah replied, still uncertain about Judith's motives. "Your insights were helpful in preparing for today's conversations." Judith hesitated, then spoke with unusual candor. "I should explain my interest more clearly. I'm not just an automotive historian." She retrieved a small leather case from her pocket and opened it to reveal an official identification. "I also consult for Interpol's Cultural Heritage Protection Division. We monitor situations where historically significant artifacts might be at risk of improper acquisition or control." "You're with law enforcement?" Sarah asked, surprised. "Not exactly. I provide expertise when needed, helping authenticate provenance and documenting ownership chains. The automotive world has become increasingly complex as values have skyrocketed. Corporate museums, national heritage claims, private collector disputes all can threaten the preservation of important vehicles." Judith's expression grew serious. "Your discovery of Mitchell's collection triggered several monitoring alerts. In our system, 17 historically significant vehicles suddenly emerging after decades of obscurity. It's exactly the kind of situation that attracts problematic attention." "Is that why you warned me about Ferrari's interest?" Sarah asked. "Partly. Corporate heritage departments sometimes use cultural significance arguments to reclaim vehicles that left their possession legitimately decades ago. It's not illegal, but it can result in historically important cars disappearing into closed corporate collections, accessible only for promotional purposes." Rebecca interjected, "Why tell us this now, after the opening?" "Because you've handled it perfectly," Judith replied with approval. "Your provenance documentation is impeccable, your legal position is sound, and most importantly, you've created a genuine cultural institution rather than just another private collection. Mitchell's legacy now has the public visibility and institutional credibility to resist inappropriate pressure." She smiled. "My job is preservation of automotive heritage, regardless of who owns it. Sometimes that means helping collections remain independent when they're properly managed for cultural rather than commercial purposes." This revelation recontextualized Judith's earlier warnings and advice. She hadn't been representing competing interests, but monitoring a situation where significant automotive history might be at risk. Her approval of Sarah's approach was professional, validation that Mitchell's legacy was fulfilling its cultural mission. The following weeks brought a whirlwind of activity. Media coverage of the opening generated unprecedented interest, with specialized automotive publications requesting in-depth features on specific vehicles. Academic researchers sought access for scholarly projects, and engineering students from prestigious universities applied for the educational programs Sarah had established. Thomas Blackwell, surprisingly, became an ally. After his client's acquisition, attempts failed. He approached Sarah with a more collaborative proposal. "My collectors understand your position on keeping the collection intact," he explained during a follow-up meeting. "Instead, they're interested in supporting specialized events and publications that feature these vehicles, associating themselves with Mitchell's legacy without ownership claims." This arrangement proved mutually beneficial. Blackwell's wealthy clients provided sponsorship for a lavish coffee table book documenting the collection, expert conservation services for particularly delicate components, and funding for advanced security systems. In return, they received acknowledgement as patrons and exclusive preview access to new exhibits. Ferrari's approach evolved as well. Rather than seeking control of the GTO, they proposed a technical partnership. Their heritage department would provide factory documentation, maintenance expertise, and historical context in exchange for research, access, and collaborative exhibitions. The revised agreement, carefully negotiated by Sarah's attorneys, preserved Mitchell's legacy's complete independence while leveraging Ferrari's resources and knowledge. By the 6-month anniversary of the opening, Mitchell's legacy had established itself as a unique institution in the automotive world. Unlike traditional museums with their comprehensive but often impersonal collections, or private collections focused on investment value, Mitchell's 17 vehicles told a cohesive story about one man's vision of automotive excellence. The museum's financial model proved surprisingly sustainable. The limited access approach, small group tours, specialized educational programs, and private viewings for serious enthusiasts generated sufficient revenue without the compromise's mass tourism would have required. The vehicles remained in the environment Mitchell had created for them, preserved as he intended yet accessible to those who truly appreciated their significance. One unexpected development came through Joseph Salvatore, the elderly mechanic, who had known Mitchell in his early days. His quiet revelation during the opening about Mitchell's relationship with Enzo Ferrari had opened doors to other connections from Mitchell's past. Former colleagues, fellow mechanics, and even drivers who had raced some of the collection's vehicles began coming forward, adding personal stories and historical context that enriched the museum's narrative. These connections revealed a side of Frank Mitchell that wasn't documented in his journals or business records. He had been more than just a skilled mechanic and discerning collector. He had been a respected figure in racing circles, known for his innovative approaches and unwavering standards. His decision to withdraw from public view had been gradual, motivated not by misanthropy, but by disappointment with the commercialization of automotive culture. One particularly significant visitor arrived unannounced on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, when the museum was closed for maintenance. Claire from the diner called Sarah directly. "There's someone here you need to meet," she said cryptically. "I'm bringing him over now." 30 minutes later, Claire arrived with an elegant Italian gentleman in his 90s, introduced simply as Signor Ferrari. Piero Ferrari, son of founder Enzo Ferrari and vice chairman of the company, had made a special trip to see Mitchell's collection personally, after hearing about it from their heritage department. "My father spoke of Francesco Martinelli occasionally," he explained, as Sarah showed him through the underground gallery. He said Martinelli understood Ferrari's soul better than many who worked at the factory for decades. Their disagreement was unfortunate, both strong-willed men with different visions for racing development. When they reached the GTO, Piero stood silently for several minutes, absorbing its presence. "This car represents a pivotal moment in our history," he finally said. "The decisions made during its development shaped Ferrari's approach to racing for the next decade." He turned to Sarah with unexpected emotion. "I am pleased it found its way to someone who understands preservation as Martinelli did. Too many significant cars have been over-restored, losing their authenticity and historical integrity. This one," he gestured toward the Ferrari, its racing patina intact. "This one still has its soul." This visit, though kept private at Piero Ferrari's request, represented a personal validation that transcended corporate interests. The son of Enzo Ferrari himself had acknowledged the legitimacy and importance of Mitchell's collection, recognizing it as complementary to rather than competing with Ferrari's official heritage. As Mitchell's legacy approached its first anniversary, Sarah received an unexpected package from Switzerland. Inside was a small wooden box containing a key and a letter from a Zurich bank. According to the accompanying documentation, Frank Mitchell had established an account there in 1985, with instructions that its contents be transferred to whoever successfully discovered and preserved his collection for at least 1 year. The account contained a substantial sum, nearly $3 million, along with a handwritten letter from Mitchell himself. "To the finder," it began. "If you are reading this, you have not only discovered my collection, but have maintained it according to my wishes for a full year. This is the test of true commitment I designed. Many can appreciate automotive beauty briefly, few dedicate themselves to its proper preservation." The letter continued. "This fund was established to ensure the collection's future beyond my lifetime. I acquired these vehicles when their values were modest, before the investment frenzy transformed automotive collecting. Their monetary worth has since increased exponentially, creating preservation challenges I foresaw decades ago." Mitchell explained that as values climbed, historically significant vehicles faced increasing risks. Excessive restoration, destroying originality, corporate reacquisition, removing them from public access, or financial pressures forcing sales that dispersed carefully curated collections. The fund was specifically designated for conservation, facility improvements, and establishing an endowment to protect the collection's integrity in perpetuity. "My vehicles are not merely assets," Mitchell's letter concluded. "They are artifacts of human ingenuity, creativity, and passion. They deserve preservation not as static displays or financial investments, but as authentic representatives of automotive excellence. You have proven yourself a worthy custodian. Use these resources to ensure they remain so for generations to come." This unexpected endowment transformed Mitchell's legacy from a promising but financially constrained startup to a securely established cultural institution. Sarah immediately consulted with financial advisors and the museum's board, which now included Rebecca, Claire, and Judith Harrington, to structure the endowment for long-term sustainability. With the financial future secured, Sarah could focus on expanding the museum's educational mission. She established a scholarship program for aspiring automotive restoration specialists, creating apprenticeship opportunities where students could learn traditional techniques under master craftspeople. The underground facility was expanded to include a conservation laboratory where preservation methods could be developed and shared with other collections. The museum also became a research center for automotive history, with Mitchell's extensive documentation forming the nucleus of a comprehensive archive. Historians and engineers studied the collection not just for its aesthetic qualities, but for the technical innovations each vehicle represented. knowledge that informed both restoration practices and contemporary automotive development. 1. Year and 3 months after her desperate purchase at the county auction, Sarah stood in the underground gallery after hours, reflecting on her unexpected journey. The dilapidated building she had acquired with her grandmother's inheritance had transformed not just physically, but conceptually, from a last-chance shelter to a cultural institution with international significance. Rebecca joined her, clipboard in hand as usual. Their partnership had evolved into a complementary leadership team, with Rebecca handling operational and preservation aspects while Sarah managed external relationships and educational initiatives. The Ferrari technical team arrives tomorrow for the collaborative documentation project, Rebecca reminded her. And Judith called, she's bringing a UNESCO representative next week to discuss potential World Heritage status for the collection. Sarah nodded, still sometimes amazed by how far they had come. Mitchell planned all of this, didn't he? Not the specifics, but the general outcome. He created a puzzle that would identify someone with the right combination of desperation, determination, and appreciation to continue his work. I think he hoped for it, Rebecca agreed. But you're the one who made it happen. Another finder might have sold the cars immediately, or kept them as a private collection, or surrendered them to corporate interests. You created something that honors his vision while making it accessible and sustainable. As they prepared to leave for the evening, Sarah paused beside the Ferrari GTO that had sparked so much controversy and ultimately collaboration. Its racing history, once nearly forgotten, was now properly documented through the partnership with Ferrari's archives. Its mechanical condition was maintained with expertise from the factory that had originally built it. Yet it remained exactly where Mitchell had placed it, preserved with the patina and authenticity he had valued. "We got it right," Sarah said softly, more to herself than to Rebecca. "These aren't just valuable objects or museum pieces. They're connections to human creativity and passion across time. That's what Mitchell was preserving and what we're continuing." As she switched off the lights, leaving the collection in its climate-controlled sanctuary, Sarah reflected on how completely her life had transformed. From automotive journalist to unemployed and nearly homeless, to the director of a unique cultural institution, all because of a desperate decision to spend her inheritance on an abandoned building that no one else wanted. The next morning brought clear skies and a sense of anticipation. The Ferrari technical team arrived early, bringing specialized equipment to document every aspect of the GTO for their historical archives. Their approach was collaborative rather than proprietary, recognizing Mitchell's legacy as a partner in preserving Ferrari's heritage rather than a competitor. Sarah watched as they worked, their reverence for the vehicle evident in every careful measurement and photograph. The senior technician, a man who had spent 40 years with Ferrari, occasionally paused to share insights about particular features or manufacturing techniques that wouldn't be documented in any manual. This was exactly the kind of knowledge exchange Mitchell would have valued. Practical expertise passed directly from those who understood these machines most intimately. Sarah had created a framework where such collaboration could flourish without compromising the collection's independence or integrity. As the morning progressed, visitors began arriving for the day's scheduled tours. Sarah greeted each group personally, introducing them to Mitchell's vision before Rebecca led them through the collection. The limited access model meant each visitor received a meaningful experience, with time to absorb details and ask questions without the crowds of conventional museums. Between tours, Sarah retreated to what had once been Mitchell's office, now her own workspace. The room retained much of its original character. Vintage automotive books lined the shelves, and Mitchell's workbench remained in one corner, tools arranged precisely as he had left them. She had added her own touches, framed magazine covers featuring articles she had written about the collection, photographs from the museum's opening, and a citation from the Classic Car Preservation Society honoring Mitchell's legacy for establishing new standards in authentic conservation. As she reviewed educational program applications, Sarah reflected on how her journalistic background had prepared her for this unexpected role. Her years of research, interviews, and writing about automotive history had given her the knowledge base to understand Mitchell's collection. Her experience crafting narratives had enabled her to tell these vehicles' stories effectively. Even her economic collapse had played its part, creating the circumstances that led her to Mitchell's property. The inheritance she had spent, nearly all she had left in the world at that point, had been more than a financial transaction. It had connected her to a legacy she was uniquely qualified to continue, a purpose that aligned perfectly with her knowledge and passion. What had seemed like a desperate gamble had proven to be an investment in something far more valuable than real estate, a cultural mission that would outlive her, just as it had outlived Frank Mitchell. As Sarah prepared for her next appointment, a meeting with education officials about expanding the apprenticeship program, she glanced at the framed photograph on her desk. It showed the dilapidated Mitchell's auto repair as it had appeared the day she purchased it, a visual reminder of how far they had come. Beside it stood her grandmother Eleanor's silver pocket watch, now restored and running perfectly. Sarah opened it, reading the inscription inside the cover. "Time reveals what passion preserves." Her grandmother, the pioneering female mechanic, would have appreciated Mitchell's devotion to automotive excellence and Sarah's unexpected role in continuing it. The watch ticked steadily in her hand, connecting past to present to future, just as Mitchell's collection connected generations of automotive creativity, and just as Sarah's museum would continue that connection for decades to come. What had begun as a desperate purchase with her inheritance had become her life's defining purpose, transforming not just her circumstances, but her understanding of value itself. The last of her grandmother's money, spent on an abandoned building nobody wanted, had ultimately purchased something priceless, a legacy worth preserving, and a future built on passion rather than mere possession. 5 years after Sarah Williams spent her grandmother's inheritance on the abandoned auto repair barn, Mitchell's legacy had become internationally renowned. The museum had expanded thoughtfully, adding a restoration workshop where apprentices learned traditional techniques under master craftspeople. The 17 vehicles remained the heart of the collection, preserved exactly as Mitchell had intended, their stories enriching visitors' understanding of automotive history. Sarah stood beside the Ferrari GTO, watching as a young woman sketched its flowing lines, capturing on paper the passion that had gone into its creation. The museum now welcomed art students alongside engineers, historians, and enthusiasts, all discovering different aspects of these mechanical masterpieces. In her office that evening, Sarah opened the small wooden box where she kept Mitchell's original letter. Its message remained her guiding principle. These weren't just valuable objects, but cultural artifacts deserving authentic preservation. Her desperate purchase, spending her last dollars on a property no one wanted, had connected her to a legacy she was uniquely qualified to continue. As sunset illuminated the showroom through specially designed skylights, the collection seemed to glow from within. What had begun as a final gamble had become Sarah's life purpose, transforming not just her circumstances, but her understanding of value itself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.